Hello, everybody. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1278th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Stephanie D'Alessandro, Stephen C. Pinson, and Neil Baldwin. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. Stephanie D'Alessandro is the Leonard A. Lauder Curator of Modern Art and Senior Research Coordinator and the creative lead of the Bluff Collaborative for research on Dada and Surrealism at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Since 2017, she has organized exhibitions that expand thinking about international modern art, including the subject of today's conversation, Man Ray, When Objects Dream. She is part of the curatorial team working on the new Tang Wing. D'Alessandro has a Ph.D. from the University of Chicago and serves on the advisory boards for the International Journal of Surrealism and Leonard A. Lauder Research Center for Modern Art. Stephen C. Pinson is curator in the Department of Photographs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Before joining the Met in 2015, Pinson headed the Miriam and Ira D. Wallach Division of Art, Prints and Photographs at the New York Public Library. His numerous exhibitions span the entire history of photographic media. Pinson holds a Ph.D. from Harvard University and an M.A. from the University of Texas at Austin, and is the author of Speculating Daguerre, Art and Enterprise in the Work of L.J.M. Daguerre. And our host today, Neil Baldwin, is the critically acclaimed author of biographies of William Carlos Williams, Thomas Edison, Martha Graham, and Man Ray, American Artist, and of the screenplay for the Emmy-nominated documentary Man Ray, Prophet of the Avant-Garde. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Neil to get us started with a lot of gratitude to Neil and Stephen and Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that interesting introduction. So I just want to say a little bit about how it's going to go today. We're going to start with some questions about the the genesis and the progress of the exhibition in general, and we're going to move through that with pictures of the site while we're talking. And then after that, we're going to start right in with the sort of signal rail graph of the show and move through the works of Man Ray. So let's start right in. As I've said, I'm interested in talking to the two of you about your curatorial practices. The epiphany, if I may use that word, when this Man Ray exhibition was conceptualized, and the gestation and development of your collaboration, which I've noticed on walkthroughs that you two have such a collegial rapport, and sort of finishing each other's sentences and supplementing and so forth. But let's start with the the moment of we want to do this, or however it happened. Stephanie, why don't you start in with that one?
Well, sure, I'm happy to. And thanks for having us. And thanks for asking us all these good questions. You've been a big fan, and it means a lot to us. You're someone who's written about Man Ray. You know his work very, very well, and the person very well. And just looking quickly through all of our guests today, I see that there's a lot of people who also have been great fans of Man Ray and scholars of Man Ray. And so it's wonderful to have everybody here today. I think there's maybe, just like Man Ray himself, there's lots of ways of telling the story of how this exhibition came about. For me, I was working on sort of almost ready to finish up a big project called Surrealism Beyond Borders. And that our wonderful director, Max Holein, got in touch with me and said that there had long been an interest in doing something on Man Ray at the Met. And could I get together with Stephen Pinson and think about if there was anything that we might be interested in doing? Was there an exhibition that could still be done? And was there something there? And it took a long time for us to get there. We did a lot of reading and a lot of thinking. Stephen, maybe I'll just stop the story there and you can restart your way or continue. But I think it's, two people to tell the story for sure.
For sure.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's basically the way it happened for me too. I think I was involved maybe slightly before you came on board, and I'm so appreciative that you did. So yeah, I think we were very mindful of the vast amount of literature that already exists, and we started with a review of that, including your amazing book, biography, Neil. And we really had in mind that we didn't want to just do a retrospective because we could have done a retrospective,
Mhm.
but we wanted to do something that we felt was fresh and perhaps a new way of looking at the work. And the more we got into it, the more we realized that having a limited date range would be more productive for us. And it seemed like although everyone knows the rheograph and is familiar with the rheograph in Man Ray's work, it hadn't really been considered in terms of his wider oeuvre in diverse media. And so once we sort of focused in on that, everything else began to fall in place. And that, of course, happened over about 3 or 4 years. So I'm not sure there was an epiphany, it would have been nice if we just had an epiphany like that, but we worked hard to settle on the focus of the exhibition.
Well, I think that uh, to me the interesting concept, which I both like both of you to talk a little bit about, is that the you chose the rheograph as the entry point, even though the beginning of the exhibition there are some paintings, of course, and Man Ray went back and forth and between all kinds of different media. But Stephen, could you just elaborate a little bit more on the how the railgraph became the point of entree for Man Ray, aside from what you were saying about the literature?
Sure. There are various ways, of course, to look at this question. For us, we wanted to focus on the period from the teens through the 20s because we feel like that early period in his work, he was really working in a very iterative way and through various media.
Hmm.
And it's sometimes hard, I think, to make sense of that work and what exactly he was doing because he was doing so many different things. And once we settled on the rheograph, we saw it as a possible through line to help explain his trajectory from even when he was doing the paintings in the teens in New York. And, he wrote this manifesto
Right.
called The Primer for the New Art of Two Dimensions, where he talks about enlivening the flat plane. And it seemed not obvious to us, but the more we looked at it, it seemed like photography and specifically the rheograph was a way to relate even those early works, what he was doing with the flat plane, collage, and then into the cliche vert and the aerographs,
Hmm.
all that led up to 1921, 1922 with the rheograph. And then coming out of that, we also saw ways to relate the work that came later. So for us, it was really this through line that it offered.
Okay, the through line, that's great. So this one's for Stephanie, to start out. Um, as you may have seen in my review of the show, which was published in the Brooklyn Rail, I'm proud to say, um, over several site visits, I've been thinking about the production values, if you will, of the space and how you worked with the exhibition staff and the designers who you talked about when we were looking at the show to coalesce the aesthetics of Man Ray with the aesthetics of the space, if you know what I'm saying. Like, because I think that the space itself, the configuration is so adept and insightful. And I'd love to hear more about
Thank you.
how that was conceptualized,
Yeah, I mean,
Stephanie.
I think maybe it's also very helpful to know that part of Stevens and my conviction about seeing the rheograph as this kind of through line was also because, like any curator does, we started building our own sort of database of images, like all of Man Ray's images from the beginning to the 30s, and we just kept filling them in and then started filling in rheographs. And as we went to visit things and look at their physical making and also study the rheograph itself, and we can talk more about that if you want,
Yeah, we
we
will
began
later.
to see it wasn't just sort of like from the literature or from our vision. It was really from our deep efforts to understand the making of these works and what was what was involved in the physical work to produce them, that we came to see the connections. And I bring all that up because the physical space was very important for us. It was
Yeah.
part of the production of the works, and it needed to be part of the production of, or the part of the experience. And so we always knew that we wanted to have a central place where we could bring together, as we did, about 50 rayographs or so. The others are around in the rest of the exhibition, where people could slow down and look at those works in a quiet, contemplative way. So
Mhm.
just like maybe you go to a movie theater, you slow down, you feel a little bit on your own. We have carpet on the floor, it's quieter, the walls are darker. We went to extra efforts to frame the works, working with all our amazing lenders so that they're similarly framed. So you really just look at the images. We wanted that experience because it's also, we found very easy to see a rayograph in one place or a photogram someplace else. You kind of quickly grab it and move on. We wanted people to feel the space and see the kind of making of these works. And we always knew that, we didn't, when we laid out the checklist, when we worked on it on our own, we never put just like all the paintings together and all the aerographs. It was this idea of like different phases, let's say, of work. And so they were at the very beginning and all the way through many, many media. And so it was important for us to make sure those spaces felt that way and that some of the connections could be felt very across many galleries or across spaces or even time in the exhibition. The exhibition is famously difficult to install in, and so I think the exhibition designer Linson Chai, who gets extra special kudos, I think, for this amazing feat, really helped us. He understood. We spent a lot of time talking together, and he understood, and we really worked together to pull the space together. Um, Stephen, do you have anything you want to
Yeah,
add?
Stephen, I wonder if you could, another element that interested me very much was the vantage points that one experienced in very quick succession. Uh, it's almost as if the exhibition is, I know it has an entrance, but
Right.
it feels as if once you get in the door, it makes its own world, and you don't feel like you're being coerced to go one way or the other. Am I
That's
getting
so
that?
nice.
That's amazing that you said that. And I'm very glad that that comes across. I think, as Stephanie said, we owe a lot of that to our wonderful colleague Linson Chai, who I think really heard us when we were talking about our concept for the exhibition and wanting to create um, relationships between the work in different media and also the different phases of Man Ray's career from the teens through the 20s. And so what comes across, I think, in the exhibition so beautifully are these sight lines that you can see
Oh,
from the
yeah.
very beginning when you enter into the first gallery of paintings from the teens. You can see in this sort of magic window the central core of the exhibition, what we call the heart of the exhibition, with the display of rayographs and also with projected on the far wall, which you also see Retour l'Horizon, his first film from 1923. And then when you go into the other spaces, you also can see across from one side of the gallery to the next. You can
Yeah.
see the Violon d'Ingres from the first major big gallery in the exhibition. And then you're able to walk back and forth between the sections of the exhibition back into the rayograph gallery.
Yeah.
So we even say in the introductory text that it's sort of, you know, an adventure at the visitor's own volition. There's not a
Oh, yes.
prescribed pathway, right?
Well, I picked up on that immediately. At one point when I was writing the essay, I thought about calling myself a flaneur, but then I thought that
Mm.
was too snobby. Okay, let's jump right in. Let's go to the first paragraph, which is number 14, slide 14. And this is sort of like, wow, okay. Um, do either of you think that it might be worth a couple of minutes to I'm sure a lot of people who are watching know what a rheograph is, but maybe you would like to give your own sort of, not explication of this particular one, but the methodology. Is there any general methodology to a rheograph, or is everyone conform to the same uh, rubric, if you will?
Well, I think that's the $10 million question, maybe. It's something that
That's why I asked it.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think part of what drew us to the rheograph, apart from all of the other things that we've already said, is that they tend to be described in a very rudimentary, basic
Yeah.
way,
Mhm.
which is how we are, perhaps many of us, familiar with them. As children, I think many of us made, sun prints by putting something on a piece of paper and light-sensitive paper, taking it outside, and then you get an imprint of whatever that object was. This is one of the oldest uh, processes in the history of photography as well. But then if you go into the dark room like Stephanie and I did early on, and you try your hand at these, it's very difficult to get the kind of effects that Man Ray
Yeah.
has. And we learned very early on that he's doing lots of different things. He's shining light from different directions. He is moving objects between exposures. So he's using, obviously transparent and translucent objects. He's even using vertical sheets of paper. So all of these things lead to the various effects that you see in his rayographs. And I'm sure Stephanie has something to
Yeah.
add as well.
Please
Well,
do.
I think one thing that Stephen has brought this up several times now. When we started this, I tried to be very industrious and I thought I'd crack the code. And so I wrote to Stephen with this list one day of like, I've started an index of all the objects that we can find in the rayographs. And after a while, it just became a joke because not only, I mean, what's so beautiful about Tristan Tzara's title for his essay in 1934 about Man Ray's rayographs, which is the subtitle of the show, When Objects Dream, is that these are ordinary objects that he allows to, let's say, dream, right? So they sometimes have this wonderful factualness, and there's a magic in their recognizable quality and what he does with them. But then they also, I feel at certain points, he almost uses other things to mimic something we might know. And so
Well, that's very well put.
my task was absolute folly, really. And maybe that was part of the way to come to see it. But it is, it's wonderful to feel not only the object's tactility, but their mystery truly at the same time. But I think one thing that's really special about Man Ray's works, also these rayographs, is the black isn't just the depth of the space that gets sort of included in that photograph, but it's actually this wonderful, almost tactile, deep space. And the paper that he uses, at least in the, I don't know, 70, 80 rayographs that we saw, maybe more, I can't even remember anymore. Yeah, definitely more than that. I feel like he's using a very specific kind of paper that's very matte. And
Yeah.
so that wonderful black has this real, you know, very physical quality to it. And that's what also makes, I think, his work very special. So it's not
Well,
just the objects, it's sort of what's left as well.
um, and now when you were speaking, I remember there was one sort of constructed wall, sort of about a third of the way into the space, going laterally. That was, I had never seen rayographs of that size. There was a series of large
Hmm.
rayographs. Um, I didn't notice, were those from one collection or did you find those? Ah, okay. I was just curious where, what the provenance of the big ones were, and I didn't even take a moment to see what dates they
Well,
were.
only maybe just to point out just quickly that he did do, there were small ones in the show and there were larger ones. And I think that we understand that the paper he used was photographic poster paper. So
Aha.
I'm right about that, right, Stephen?
For the large ones,
Yeah, the banjo ones.
yeah, it's the same kind of, it still has the same kind of matte surface that he was generally used. But yeah, that large format, he did around 10 to 12 of them that we know of.
Yes,
Um,
see that? Yeah.
yeah, it's very very unusual for that time,
Yes,
obviously,
yes,
for
it
such a
is.
large paper.
It is.
Yeah.
It really is. So they've moved on
But
without.
maybe just to also say about that
I'm,
format, remember early in the show, man and woman,
yeah,
the
I am
large
talk
early
about that.
photographs. So those are also very big. So it's
Yeah.
not the first time he does a format like that.
No, it just that in my travels, I know it was a long time ago. I saw a lot of railgraphs. I never saw any that were
Hmm.
so monument. I thought they were monumental to me relative to the normal size. Okay, let's move on to the next one now. I'm ready for the next one now. Okay, so this is good to have this particular succession because if you had to explain the difference in how the first one we saw and this one were made, is it possible or even necessary to make a distinction between how the two of them are made? Because one seems very fixed and this one is very fluid. So what would the actual method of that be? Were you able to figure that out?
Well, I don't, I think after a certain point, Stephen and I didn't, I mean, some of it is chance. That's what's
Yeah.
beautiful about it. I think we sort of moved away from totally trying to figure out how they were made to kind of understanding some of the ideas or some of the, I don't know. I think what struck us in this work was, of course, the woman's face that you see there. So we know
Yes.
that he was using photography materials and then printing them in the rayograph. So they get reversed because everything in a rayograph is reversed. And so if you use a negative, it's going to turn into a positive in the rayograph. That was really amazing, especially looking at the film.
I
I
think also
see.
to recognize in several circumstances, there are direct relationships between the rayographs and the films that he's working on
Yeah, that's what I would
simultaneously.
expect. Mhm.
So this is not necessarily the case here, although this was printed, I believe, in Les Cahiers du Mois in 1925,
Two.
I think,
Oh,
around the time where he was working with Henri Chaumet, who was an avant-garde filmmaker at the time. And Man Ray was very much part of the discussion around avant-garde film. And often, interestingly, in these um, articles in journals, not the film stills weren't necessarily published, but it was the rayographs that were published. And I think that people,
that's
because of this sort of cinematic space that's created in the rayographs, there was even at the time a perception that they had something to do with film and cinema in the world of, moving images. So I think this one is such a great example of that relationship.
oh, that's very interesting. Could you just repeat the filmmaker that you were talking about? I don't think I.
Henri Chaumet.
And what was the work that you
The
just?
film, it has a complicated title. It's À quoi rêvent les jeunes films? What do young what do young films dream
Oh,
about?
I
And
see.
it
I
was
see.
one of these instances in which Man Ray was initially involved in the film,
Hmm.
and then it became sort of a product of what he felt was too many hands in the pie, and he sort of backed away from it.
Hmm.
But he remained associated with the film nevertheless. Man
Okay.
Ray was famous for saying that he never wanted to work with more than, two people was enough for him. Um, which is why he always explained his sort of backing away from film and film production because he felt like there were too many people involved in it.
I never heard that before. And it reminds me of why he backed away. I mean, I know he was a surrealist in kind of a generic sense, but he insisted to Andre Breton personally that he was not a member of anything. I mean,
Right.
I'm not saying that is uh, historically definitive, but in his mind, he was not a member. Stephanie, did that resonate with you at all?
I think if an artist chooses not to identify as a surrealist, then we'll take them at their word, but it doesn't mean that they weren't part of a circle they weren't
Yeah.
influenced by those ideas, they didn't partake. But if they didn't want to be part of a group or identify, that's doesn't mean it didn't exist, right?
You can still go to the cafe floor and sit around the table with a lot of people, regardless of what
Yeah.
their denomination is. Okay, let's go on to the next, please. Okay. Now here, okay, I wrote to myself on note, and I hope it doesn't sound pretentious, but the dynamics of an illusion, because I feel as if this one um, has a more evocative spatial quality, thoughts, regardless
I
of
think
the
this is, interestingly, this is one of the bigger, the large format works
okay.
that we have in the Met's collection. And
Oh, yes.
it is, in some ways, it's different, not only in the fact that it's large, but this kind of fluid space that you see in the image is also a little bit unusual, I would say. And this is one of the ones, Stephanie and I went into the dark room, as we said, but our great, great, great collaborators in the Department of Photograph Conservation were the best of interlocutors throughout this entire process. And they went into the darkroom as well, I would say, much more successfully
Yes.
than we did.
Oh, yeah.
And this is one of the ones that they actually were very, very interested in trying to figure out. And they never were able to quite crack the code. So you're right in sensing that there's something unusual and different about this one in particular.
Well, crack the code. Now, you've both of you have used that phrase in the last half hour. Just I happen to notice since I'm interviewing you. But what do you exactly? Let's take Stephanie. What did you mean by crack the code? And then we'll
I
ask
have
Stephen.
no idea in what
Oh,
circumstance I used it, but I'm sure I did because I think, I mean, there's just so many. It's part of what's wonderful about Man Ray is that what he's doing in the dark room is, um, he very in the very beginning when he sends out the subscription card for Champs Delicieux, he talks about the state in which the works were made, which I find such a wonderful acknowledgement at that time. And, we can think of it in many different ways, but an openness, a fluidness, um, it's not something that's easily retrievable in notes from an artist or in an X-ray, let's say. And so I think oftentimes I think about this project and never cracking a code like we might if we, look at the surface of a painting and we see a circle and then we X-ray it and realize it's a smiley face underneath a
oh,
landscape, right? In this particular case, there's a there's a there's there's a level of creation, production, whatever we want to call it, that remains Man Ray's. That's only the artist really knows how those things are made, and maybe he might have also been surprised sometimes. I hope he was surprised by the effects sometimes. So for me, as I said, I tried that index for a while. I tried to be very studious and I think there's a level of understanding. Sometimes you get the parts all together and like you try to make a cake and it falls. Another time you make it and it's amazing and tastes good. And the next time you make it, it doesn't taste the same. And so I think that's part of the cracking the code for me is just getting close, getting a sense of what were the the ingredients that might have been at the table or the players that might have been on the game board and
hmm.
appreciating the product in the end is almost a part of it for me. That sounds like a lot of hooey probably, but I feel like there were the only times we felt like we might have cracked a code is, if there was something in an agenda that lined up with something that we supposed, or we found a letter where he said something that we had been curious about, but never the sort of actual full on, we have an understanding of the radiographic process, but never a full on, we can't tell you exactly what he did here, but it's an amazing thing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I think
Steve.
there's also, just to add a little bit, I think um, there was a back and forth for us, cracking the code, yes, is I think early on we were all trying to figure out how exactly he did something. And then we sort of realized that that was maybe not the most useful way to approach the work, but it's also fun to do, right?
Yeah.
When you look at these things, you want to figure out, well, what exactly is that? What was the object? So I think that's perfectly fine. And I think,
Oh, 100%.
yeah, we still, it's fun to look at them and do that. But at a certain point, and Neil, you have, I think, firsthand experience with this, looking at Man Ray's self-portrait, the 1963 autobiography. There's a lot of information in there, but there are no dates, and
Right.
there's a lot of obfuscation,
Oh, yes.
um, and a lot of, blaming the what was clearly the result of labor and, hard work with accidental discovery. And so I think part of the cracking the code for us too became looking at what he wrote and then going back and looking at the
Yeah.
materiality of the work and figuring out somewhere in there there's always a grain of truth, and how much could we put together things by always going back to the work itself and then comparing that with what we found in his own writing and in the archive. So it all became sort of a
Yeah.
like a detective work in a way.
And
Well,
also,
yeah,
I think
sorry, go on.
just also learning learning Man Ray's language, learning how he thought as best as we could. So like this is a big one. Steve and I spent a lot of time um, in the autobiography when Man Ray uses quotes and says, I discovered the rayograph, right? This one mythic night when he discovers the rayograph. And it was frustrating because like, how does he not know about a rayograph at this or a photogram at this time, right? And some people talk about Christian Schad's shadographs that were with Tristan Tzara, and maybe he saw them. We know that since Man Ray kind of came at photography on his own, there were lots of you know, manuals at the time that talked about how to make these. They were a popular pastime. Um, I think at a certain point we came to see when he says discovered, he doesn't mean I alone discovered these for the very first time. He discovered them for himself as the medium through that he had been looking for, right? So it's also kind of understanding Man Ray's work and his language to also, instead of sort of coming to it again with that kind of, especially in my mind, sort of as the person I am, looking for the definitive smoking gun of the code. That's not what he meant at all. At least I don't believe so at
Well,
this time. I think he was using it a different way.
my motivation, as I said in the preface to the biography, that was my motivation
Yeah,
for me. I read this ironically titled Self-Portrait, and I just felt like having, I mean, as a biographer, I felt like there were so many correctives that needed to be made. So for me, as an analogy, it's funny
yeah,
to think of the analogy because um okay, of course I wanted to see everything, sort of like what you all did. But I also had to align the aesthetic decisions with what he was doing, like what was going on, which is why I think we should move. Can we move to Le Violon d'Ingres, which is number 18, please? There we go. Now, Stephen, when we were in the walkthrough, I was very, very taken by how you explain those F holes on her back. The the proximity of the surfaces. Would you just tell everybody about that one? Because that's I'd like to sort of start there because it was so interesting what you said.
Sure. I mean, obviously, there's so much to say about this iconic
Oh God,
work.
yes.
But but for us, why it was so essential in the exhibition, apart from, it's hard to imagine having an exhibition that covers this period without this work in it, is the involvement of the rayograph. And this is such a great example of how he's taking this technique that he's been working with for a couple of years, he's already immediately applied it to film with Return to Reason in 1923. And here he takes this cameraless technique of the rayograph or the photogram and combines it with his portraiture that he's making with a camera. So there's an earlier iteration of this that is the one that is published in 1924 in Littérature. And there's a smaller version that's at the Pompidou in Paris where he has applied those F holes, the sound holes on Kiki's back with ink.
Right.
And so that was made to be reproduced in a magazine, right? So in the magazine, you can't really tell that they're added by ink, but if you look at the original, it's a very different sensation of looking at this print. And the way that he does this is by enlarging that photograph, taking it into the darkroom. He creates a mask in which he cuts out the shapes of the sound holes, lays that over the photograph, re-exposes it, and then you get basically a rayograph. Those sound holes on the back are made by a rayograph technique. And what it does is creates this seamless surface so that it looks like when you're looking at the photograph, there's no separation between the sound holes and Kiki's body.
That's what's
As if they are there intrinsically,
there. Yeah.
inherently. And so I think, this is what he wanted to do this to push that idea, that original idea further. And I think this is why it's become such an iconic image, especially around surrealism and, dream objects, because it's sort of,
Juxtaposition. Yeah.
yeah.
And he
So
calls this work a Rayo photo, right? So he
really, you
acknowledges it
did? Oh, I
as
had no
a
idea.
hybrid object of sorts.
A
Yeah.
rail photo. That is very, very profound. I didn't know about that. Stephanie, I was going to ask if you could explain uh, the why Angla is provenanced in there.
Oh dear. Well,
Just, just
it's a long story, but the short answer would be that Ingres is a great painter from another time who
right,
is very much appreciated. And there's a saying at the time of the violin of Ingres, which is a kind of a slogan, a shorthand, whatever for a hobby horse, basically, or
right.
for a hobby, I
Mhm.
should say. And so there's an insinuation in this of Kiki being part of his private life, either woman as a hobby or Kiki as his hobby or music as a hobby, but there's also the kind of larger implication by the work itself, of course, which has little to do with anger, except that he had a lot of naked, beautiful women in his pictures, of course, of playing this woman's body like an instrument. So there's different levels depending on the time period in which you look at the work, I think.
That's
But the
very, very, yeah.
references to the great French painter.
I thought, though, to give Stephanie more credit maybe than she's giving herself, I think she did a
Yeah,
lot of research around this and found that at the time in the 1920s, right, violon d'Angre was more about not so much uh, associated with a hobby, but with the fact that Ingres apparently was more proud of his violin playing, which was
that's
apparently
right.
very mediocre, than he was of his painting. So
Yes.
there was this idea that maybe it also had something to do with Kiki being the center of Man Ray's creative private life,
Yes.
and maybe less to do at the time with what it now has become associated with, which is, a hobby.
Yes.
Yes, because just to elongate that anecdote that you just said, from in my research also, uh, I came across the idea of Ankle playing the violin, but also that people who came to visit his studio to see the works, first he would make them sit down and listen to him play his violin, like do a little concert for them, before he allowed them to proceed to the actual artworks, which I thought was kind of Man Ray-ish sounding, actually. Okay, let's go to 21, please. Okay, this one I just, well, I find this to be, this is definitely this struck me as being in a class by itself as a railgraph. So
Agreed.
why is it, why do I feel that way, Stephanie?
Well, I'm not in your head, so I don't know
Oh
why you
no,
feel
you're
that
not.
way.
Oh,
But I
sorry.
can tell you, I mean, this is one of those wonderful works that Stephen and I appreciated so much because you can
Oh,
just feel this shift in his work. Not
yeah.
always, but there's this, let's say, opening of a new avenue where objects are, they might still be identifiable, but they also become, they start to dream, they start to morph, they start to change. So, what we know is that that's a little toy boat, and that sea that the boat is on is actually a big feather.
Oh,
And the moon is made by a little, it's a little like some kind of stencil that he's put on the paper. So it's bright and clear like a moon would be. And all those things, I can't tell you what's in the background. But all those parts are real things, but he's now putting them into this kind of wonderful dreamscape, seascape. And there's a whole series of them at this time. And
oh,
so he's taking objects, they still are the objects, but he's putting them into something. He's changing their function or their role. And there's also a wonderful set of kind of rheograph objects that he makes at this time, composites of bits and pieces, like his sculpture that's sort of more in the poetic object, surrealist sort of mode, putting two things together and seeing kind of the magic that can come from it. In the same kind of vein as these rheographs, so they are wonderful. They're very funny, and magical. And this is one of our favorites.
Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Stephanie just said. I think, there is this really wonderful series of these sort of um, almost fantasies in a way. They're
Yes, yes,
either,
yes.
they look like some of them even look like sort of lunar, landscapes, from another world, and they all feature this moon-like astral orb. And sometimes, there's another iteration of it where it becomes expanded, almost like he's shining a light through a marble. That was one of the things we gave up ever trying to figure
Wow.
out how exactly he did that effect, but it's really quite remarkable. And there are several of them in the collection of Yale that are reproduced in the catalog. And I really encourage people to look at those because occasionally he'll do this. He often worked in series, obviously, when he was making the rayographs, using some objects over and over again. But occasionally there will be like a little sort of flight of works that are clearly related to each other. These are all from around 1925. And it's hard to know exactly what he was, thinking of at the time. But I think another one of the things that I love so much about this one is that in L'Étoile de Mer, The Starfish, the film from 1928, there's this fabulous scene where there is this clearly a cut out image of a boat, like a paper boat moving across the screen. And then it's cut very quickly with an actual ship that's moving across
Yeah.
the sea. So I think it's just, it's one of those. I think, he was having fun also. He was doing this as a creative outlet. And I think he enjoyed sort of coming back and revisiting certain motifs throughout his career. So it's a really great work. That
Yes,
was
it
owned by
is.
Breton. I think you said that,
Oh,
Steph.
I didn't. Okay, I forgot that you mentioned that. It was owned by Breton. That's
And it
worth.
still is in the family. Oh, I
Ah,
shouldn't say that, maybe.
so private collection? Is that what you mean? That's
I
the
don't know.
private collection. We don't know. It's
I don't
private.
know.
We don't know. We don't know. Okay. Next, move onwards. Okay. So now I'm trying to, you know, when we were putting this together, we want to make sure we at least cover some of the other manifestations, let's call it. So, Stephanie, would you, I believe when you were talking about this in the walkthrough, there was some kind of at one point became woman or man, or it wasn't always man. It was renamed as woman. Would you just
Yes.
tell me of that? Yeah.
Yes. So he makes this work, which is actually an egg beater, um,
Yeah.
perturbed by its shadow and the point of view that he takes the photograph. And to underscore, this is the work that I was talking about before when we were talking about the large scale rayographs. This is a very big
Yeah,
photograph, very
huge.
big photograph. And yes, he originally names it L'Homme or Man. And then he makes another photograph that's another constructed, well, it's an object, but it's constructed a kind of assemblage of materials from his photo studio, also kind of disguised in a certain way by shadow and perspective. And he calls that one La Femme or woman. And when he later sends these works out to Tristan Tzara, who's like this wonderful fairy ghost throughout the whole story of Man Ray in the teens and 20s, I think, always pushing Man Ray forward. He sends them to be published in an almanac that never happens called Dada Globe. The titles get reversed. And he's totally fine with that.
They get reversed, you mean accidentally or
So that
dynastically
I
or
think
what?
they get mislabeled, if
Ah,
I'm remembering right. Stephen, is that correct?
It's not, I, I don't think it's totally resolved how it happened,
Okay,
whether it was intentional or,
I can't
but it
remember.
was when they were, and it was when they were exhibited.
Okay. And yes, but he's perfectly fine with that.
yeah.
So I think I don't know, we can interpret what we want from it, but I think what's really special about these this work and the other is their sheer size. And at
Yeah.
this moment, this is not a moment when people are making their mark as artists by making photographs.
No.
And certainly it's a subject, let's say, it's a portrait of a man, let's say, but it's an object. And so he's playing with ideas about Dada and the hierarchies of art. And, he's young, but he's definitely coming out swinging very, very early.
I think he's also probably very aware of the fact that, it's man in English and he's man, so there's
Yeah.
also
Oh,
that.
yes.
In some ways, that's a self-portrait also. I think, he's also made that sort of assemblage from slightly
Right.
earlier that's with the
With the
buzzer,
handprint,
yeah,
Oh,
the
yeah.
handprint and the
yeah,
doorbell that doesn't work, which
that's
he
called
calls
self-portrait.
self-portrait. Yeah. So the mechanical version of himself.
Mhm.
I also just, if I could just mention very quickly,
Yes,
since
yes,
we're
yes. I'm
talking
just
about the
thinking.
large paper, I already mentioned our great colleagues in the photo conservation department here, but we also worked very closely with the Lens Media Lab when it was still up and running at Yale, and Paul Messier, really throughout the entire exhibition planning and research to help understand better the materials that Man Ray was using and specifically related to the rayographs, and also with the great artist Alison Rossiter, who has an amazing collection of vintage papers. Um,
Oh,
so we were better able to understand some of the papers and the materials that he was using. So I just wanted to make sure that that was mentioned before it got away from us.
Can I round out the
Of
circle
course.
and
sure.
also say
Yes.
that we also had a big group of collaborators at MoMA, Yale, and the Getty, conservators and curators, who shared their collections with us to be part of a large study of the rayograph. So there was a lot of background work that was happening around this project.
Oh, yes. Well, if what I mean, all one has to do is
Yeah.
no, I'm just saying that because I want to try to have a little time to ask you about the catalog, but for now, let's continue on number 20. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about, for those of you who are the uninitiated, who is Lee Miller and this technique, which is called solarization. So, Stephen, would you like to just explain what a solarization is, a solarized photograph is?
I will do it in a very basic way.
Yes,
Um,
of course.
this is similar to the rayograph. There are various stories about how they came upon this process in
Yeah,
1929. Again, the result apparently of an accident, if we would believe both Lee Miller and Man Ray.
that a mouse ran over her
Yeah,
foot.
that's one of the stories. Um,
Oh,
so who knows? But It's clear, I think, to everyone who's looked more carefully into this, and again, all of our collaborators and interlocutors and people who were trying very hard to explain exactly how this was made and tried to repeat the process. It's extremely, extremely difficult to get this result of this beautiful contour line around the subject of the
Yeah.
photograph, which you see here in this most pristine, beautiful example of Lee Miller. Lee was a model from New York who was tired of being a model, so she came to Paris in 1929 to seek out Man Ray specifically to learn photography. She knew that he had had several apprentices, including Berenice Abbott, and he eventually agreed to take her on as an assistant. She quickly became not just an assistant, but I think really a professional partner and collaborator. And of course, his romantic partner for a few years as well. But it was really together that they perfected this process. So I think she needs to have, due recognition for her role here. But just to give a very basic understanding, this was not a new process. It's a result of overexposure or a second exposure. And the way that Man Ray and Lee Miller typically approached it was by exposing the negative a second time during development. And
Mm.
they were able to eventually come up with a way of doing that that created this beautiful, what Lee Miller called a halo around
Yeah.
the object. And sometimes it's around specific, even body parts like hands, or there's a great self-portrait of Man Ray. So they were really the ones that were able to do this to the extent that this particular portrait was reproduced many times in the early 1930s, and it became sort of this bane of existence for amateur photographers who tried as they might were unable to reproduce this effect in their solarized photographs.
Mm. Boy. Um, okay, Stephanie, I would like you to explicate the next image which is about to come up.
Well, I
Surprise.
can I can do my best, but my colleague is the real photo expert here. I'll only just say that this is a portrait of the great fashion icon and artistic, I don't know, personality, the Marchesa Casati, who, like many people, came to Monterey to get her portrait made. And because we've had access to the negative of this photograph, we know that it looks like this. So it's certainly not doctored in the print or, in some kind of printing method. And what we also believe is that it was, he says that she liked it this way and that it was, again, I think, an accident. But either it's likely that she moved or the camera moved, but this is what was caught on film. And Stephen, please jump in if I'm telling everybody something that's incorrect, because Stephen is the great
No,
photo
no,
person in this and not me.
it,
But I think what I think is so fascinating about this work, and it's one of the reasons we wanted it also for the show, is because in a larger way, with a group of works that we've gathered together, it's a section that we feel really shows not just how a photograph can take an egg beater and make it look different, but the real invention and possibility that photography itself offered Man Ray, the ability to capture something that we can't catch with our eye, and put it still for a moment for us to see. And this is, of course, the moment of, the Aragon talks about le mouvement flou, and this, whether it's, the strange stretching of a photo or its blurriness or the possibilities that exist in this moment of lack of definition from the end of Dada to the beginning of Surrealism. It's represented in photos like this.
So what did you just to rewind to the beginning of what you're talking about? Um, so was it determined that she did move, or that another a, a technique was applied? I missed that part. Just in terms of the double image was.
I have
Stephen,
to,
you wrote about this. Why
yeah,
don't
I
you
have,
why don't you
Yeah,
jump in?
yeah.
I
That's
have
the
to,
part that I've never gotten to the
I don't
point.
think probably because there is no there there. I talked to so many different people. You wouldn't believe how many conversations we
Oh
have
yeah.
on this
Oh yeah.
particular image, including, practitioners that looked both at the print and the glass plate negative from which it's made.
Glass plate.
It's it's clear that the effect was not it wasn't, two different negatives. It wasn't a double exposure. It
Yeah,
was a
that's
single
what I meant.
exposure. But even looking at the print and the negative together, it's really impossible to know if it was the camera that was moving or whether it was Casati that was moving or a combination of both. There was some enhancement of the effect
Yes.
when it was printed, but the triple set of eyes are in the negative. They're not, added. They're not additive.
They're
And I
in the
think what's
negative.
particularly telling for me is that this is reproduced fairly quickly afterwards in Vanity Fair,
Yeah.
and the reproduction is even more highly manipulated so that her shoulders disappear completely. She just has this long
Yeah.
giraffe neck, which seems
Really?
to be, I think for me, again, this is just my hypothesis, is that this was a very intentional um, self-presentation, and that it might, in fact, have been sort of a collaborative effort between Man Ray and Casati to sort of present her. She said it was he saw into her soul in this
Well, I know
photograph.
she liked the picture. I know that it
Yeah,
wasn't like because I remember reading that she said, "Oh, I want this. This is good. This is good. This is really good." Okay, we're on to let's go to 30, please. Now, um, I wanted to end with a painting, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to explain what is there a segue to this painting, or did it spring up sort of as a incongruous, in terms of when it was made? This was like an anomaly, or was it a natural segue?
Um, Stephen, why don't I start and
yeah,
you
yeah,
jump
please
in?
do.
Well, this work is called Swedish Landscape, and there's a rayograph that's probably from about 1925 that is related at least by title.
Oh, okay.
For Stephen and I, it's actually kind of this is a painting that's on canvas, and it's quite large
Yeah.
for these kind of abstract paintings that Man Ray is making in the early 20s. And we see it as part of a smaller group of important pictures that Man Ray started painting around 1923
Hmm.
that in many ways seem to be after a year, let's say, of not making any paintings at all in 22, when he's flying high making rayographs, he returns to painting even though he swore off what he calls the sticky medium of paint, and either in formal ways or in methods of making applies the experiences that he had from the rayograph onto a surface with oil paint. And those works are typically composition board, small scale, like the size of rayographic, the paper he uses for his rayographs, or they are on things like sandpaper or metal. And he makes a group of them that seem to have been well appreciated by his friends, like Andre Breton owned one and Louis Aragon owned another. And he showed them, we think. But this work is much larger. It's probably two times at least as large, if not three, and seems to not be, there's no exact predecessor for it, but it
No.
might be that. He made this one photograph and felt the rayograph, excuse me, that uses little match book, like little lines of matches as some kind of landscape element, and might have thought, oh, I'll give it another try. The fact that he did it as a canvas feels like almost kind of like a summa, like trying one more time to give
Yeah.
it a whirl. But I mean, certainly it's a quite interestingly worked picture, applied materials, as well as using the palette knife and the back of the knife probably to inscribe a bit. Stephen, I must have missed something in everything that I just babbled.
No, I think you did a great job of covering it. I think if people are able to come to the exhibition or have seen the exhibition, they know, as you said, that this is sort of preceded by this wonderful group of small, intimate paintings from
Yeah,
1923 that have a much more um, either the way of making them or some kinds of formal similarities seem to be related to his experience of having made rayographs in 1921, 22. Um, and then this one, as Stephanie said, seems to be like he's actually revisiting something that
Yeah.
he's actually already created in a rayograph, the way that he does throughout his career. You know, there are so many examples of taking a motif or a theme
Mhm.
and exploring it in different media.
Do you know
And
the
that's
rayograph that we were looking at with the little toy boat and the feather?
yeah,
So that series of sort of lunar landscapes, seascapes, whatever, dreamscapes, that's sort of the moment of this painting. And so it's
yeah,
sort of interesting to think about. I don't think he actually used matchsticks to make those little pink and yellow objects, but it's interesting to think about using something somewhat recognizable in the middle of this otherwise kind of inventive scape.
yeah. I think that's a perfect uh, circle from where we began, and it also happens to be our time has been, how shall I put it? We don't have any more time. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but we don't. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been such a pleasure to listen to. Thank you, Neil and Stephanie and Stephen. We're now going to start the audience Q&A portion of the event. If you have a question, please post it to the form at the link in the chat. Now's your chance. The first question today is going to be from Andrew. Andrew asks, are there artists, photographers following after Man Ray who one could say were inspired by him or acknowledge him as an inspiration? Thank you for this wonderful presentation.
Well, I don't know. I would say to start, I mean, the whole time we did the show, we were thinking of Moholy,
Yeah.
who's very much right at Man Ray's shoulder. Um, I don't know that he was inspired by Man Ray, but they were certainly working, you know, at the same ideas in different ways. But I think, you know, Moholy's approach to the photogram and the paintings and works on paper that he made have a different origin of interest than Man Ray's for sure. So even if they have a certain shared look, they're very different. And I would say Man Ray's are much more object bound. There's something sort of, it's hard to exactly put a an idea to it, but I feel like Moholy's are much more about sort of space or kind of larger. I don't know, it's not spiritual, but there's something else that's at work. And Man Ray's right here. He's with us and he's exploring this in a different kind of like human bound way, if that makes sense. Stephen, can you think of someone?
Well, I think there are probably countless,
Yeah.
you know, artists that, you know, even working today. We mentioned
Oh, yeah.
Alison Rossiter. I think, you know, she's currently making, she makes photograms essentially. She develops expired photographic papers. Um, but, you know, also the apprentices that passed through his studio in the 1920s, you know, from Lee Miller to Berenice Abbott to Bill Brandt, you know, not to say that they were influenced, you know, directly, but, you know, having learned the technique of photography from him, you know, there's like a whole generation of photographers, practicing photographers at the time who came through Man Ray's studio. So I think there are lots of different ways to think about that question. And I think we've been so inspired, you know, talking about inspiration, to see the artists that are so excited about the
Yeah.
exhibition and, you know, to think about this kind of creative freedom that he had working across so many different media. And I think people feeling so a certain kinship with that, sort of this not being beholden to a certain medium or to a certain genre. And so that's been like a joy for us as well to see.
Thank you for those answers and thanks for that question, Andrew. The next question is from Janice. Janice is wondering, is there a catalog raisonné of Man Ray's of that we can access?
There are
Well,
several in the works.
yeah.
There are
Supposedly.
several in the works.
Well, there's a great catalog raisonné that we're all anticipating from the great scholar Stephen Manford on the rayographs. There are, I think, two different projects or three projects. There's one project on the paintings, I think, underway by Andrew Strauss and Timothy Baum. And
Oh,
then
yes.
there are two different, I think, projects on objects, one by Marion Meyer and the Man Ray Trust in Paris. So there we desperately anticipate them and look forward to their reasoned catalogs.
We should also mention Emmanuelle de Lecote and her great
Of
work on the
course.
rayograph, which is not, it's not, I guess, really a catalog raisonné because it's not necessarily all of the rayographs, but it's certainly an essential
Yeah.
work in anyone who's looking at the rayograph.
Thank you for those answers and thanks for that question, Janice. We'll stay tuned for the catalog raisonné projects. The next question is from Emily Noël Lambert. I'm fascinated by the connection of the rayograms and what looks like assemblage paintings. Fascinating how he is bridging sculpture, painting, and photographs. Can you speak to that a bit? What do you think informed this? Is it creative freedom?
Mm.
Hmm.
I think one thing that Stephen and I began to think about was both with the rayograph as well as the aerograph, which feels like very much like the pre-1921, 22 stepbrother to the rayograph in certain ways, was that in making some ourselves and understanding some of the work involved in them, the, if we're talking about a rayograph where Man Ray is working with the paper horizontally, that he's moving things around and building things sometimes, or if he's making it with the paper vertically and he's building something up and shooting it this way, he is actually working in a sculptural process. It does feel like an assemblage. It also feels like an installation. It also feels like a kind of record of a performance. And I think that was part of what sort of unlocked thinking for us of like the larger project that Man Ray's after in those works, like really thinking about taking space and accounting for that place that he's making that work, if that makes sense. Um, I don't know, Stephen, do you have anything to add?
I would just say that in around, I guess it's 1962, 63, as he's writing his autobiography, he also revisits the rayograph, which is something that
Right.
he hasn't done. He makes them periodically between 1929 and 1960. Um, but in 62, he revisits the idea of this album, which it's how he first introduced the rayograph to the world in 1922 with the album Chant de l'Essieu. He makes another album in the early 60s of 12 rayographs, and he writes this very interesting introductory essay, and he talks about the rayograph as being durational, and that
Good.
we sort of found that text towards the end of our process, but it, I think, underlined and emphasized for us all of the things that we suspected all along, that he saw this as Stephanie just said, as a kind of performance, as a kind of installation, as a kind of record that wasn't just an instant, how we typically think of a photograph, but it's actually a record of time.
When was this? When was this durational phrase used?
I believe this album, 12 Rayographs or Rayograms, I think it's called, is from 62. But I could be a year or so off.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful.
It's cited at the very beginning of our introduction to the catalog. So you can find it there.
1963.
Thank you.
Thank you all for those answers. The next question is from Maria Elena Gonzalez. Maria asks, could you expand on the quote near this last painting shown where Man Ray said something like he longed to touch paint?
Hmm.
Well, I think that was in 29. So the painting that we showed at the end was from 26, so it's just before that. What we can say is that this is a period from mid-teens through the 20s that Man Ray is, you will see him constantly conflicted with whether he can call him, he is proud to say he's a photographer, and he has now committed to photography as his new medium, or he is still a painter, or has always been a painter, or secretly wishes that painting was the thing that he was best known for. And so he never really, he can't quit it, as it were. So this is a moment in 29 after doing lots of great photography where he longs so much to touch paint that he actually gets a separate studio where he paints in the morning and then in the afternoon goes back and works on his photography. It's interesting that he sees them as separate.
Yeah, in 23, he says that he writes to Ferdinand Howell, his great patron in the States who helped fund his original trip to Paris, and says that he's finally left behind the sticky medium of paint. That's what he says in
Right.
22. And then the next year, 23, is when he starts this small group of small-scale paintings.
Mhm.
Thank you for those answers. The last question today invites you to speculate, and I'm going to add a little bit to it. The question is from Beth, who asks, what do you think Man Ray would have thought of your exhibition? And I would go as far as to ask, how did Man Ray feel about exhibitions of his work in general?
I feel like Neil should answer that question.
That's kind of part of what my reading at the end, which I don't want to preempt, but it has to do with that question. So
Maybe we'll save it for that then. Thank you all
please.
so much for your questions today. I'm now going to turn it over to Neil for that reading, but not without saying thank you again to Stephanie and to Stephen and to Neil for this conversation and for answering our questions.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, I'm very honored to be part of this complex assortment of geniuses, I must say. So what I chose was a brief excerpt because uh, my book was originally published in 1988. If you can get your mind around that. Then it was republished as a paperback in the year 2000 with a new introduction by me, which part of which I talked about if I had another chapter in the book, what would it be about? Like, when you finish a biography, you feel like you're not really finished. And it was on my mind for about 10 years or so. So I'm just going to read that part where I talk about my hypothetical new chapter, which I never really got to write. It begins, I'm talking to Naomi Savage, who was a photographer who was Man Ray's niece, and she studied with him in LA in the 40s, and he showed her how he did his rayographs. She went into the studio with him and she worked with him. And one day I complained to Naomi. I said that I've been meeting with all these contemporaries of Man Ray because I was writing the book in the 80s. So I was meeting all of the 85-year-old French and other artists that were still around. And they would allude to his circumspect language about his personal life, which was exactly what I was trying to find out about. And she says to me, Man always used to say to me, the work has already been done. If you want to find out about me, look at my work. That's where the answers are, if there are any. The persistent mystery of Man Ray makes him permanently seductive. The more we search for meaning in his photography or painting or collages or objects, the more we are driven conversely into ourselves. The more we follow his opaque instructions to delve into the so-called significance of his work, the more we are coerced into yet another deeper layer within our own minds, because that undiscovered country is where he wants us to get lost. When I was engaged in my research, I resolved to view as many works by Man Ray as possible, museums, archives, and private collections. They would ask me what aspect of the holdings I was interested in, and I would say everything. Gordon Baldwin of the Getty Museum, housed back then in an office building in downtown Santa Monica, sat patiently next to me for an entire day and flipped through each and every box in their magnificent collection of Man Ray photographs. And John C. Waddell and Roz Jacobs and Dorothy Norman and Pierre Matisse, among a host of others, allowed me into their New York City homes where I far outstayed my welcome. That compulsive, omnivorous drive to touch and see it all was impossible to satisfy with Man Ray, and yet he forced me to try, because I started out believing his mystery was penetrable. He created that illusion through the excruciating irony of the photographic medium. He chose the most technologically specific art form of all to enact his belief in the elusiveness of the so-called real world. This belief went beyond surrealism as a mere movement. The mystery of my final unwritten chapter thus plays upon the conceit of an artist who set out through the sheer corpus of his production to define at once everything and nothing. He was a worker from morning till night, even in his later rising homebound years. He has blanketed our world with depictions affirming his genuine love of the phenomenal culture he inhabited, meant to draw us out of that world and deeper into ourselves.
Thank you so much, Neil. That was such a beautiful way to conclude today. Thank you, to Stephen and Stephanie again for this conversation today. Thank you to Matthew Tom at the Met for providing those beautiful images that we were looking at together today. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our NSE program, along with Tiger Foundation, for making these conversations possible and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports us, our writers, our staff, and our operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free on Monday at a special time of 12:30 Eastern, please join a conversation between Tommy Ka and Billy Mandel on the occasion of Ka's exhibition, on the occasion of the Hayes Prize, Other Things Uttered at the Addison Gallery of American Art. And as is Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for joining us today, and take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
you
you
very much.
Thank
Thank
That was
you.
beautiful. Thank you
Good
so much.
conversation. Be well, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stephen and Neil.
Thank you.
Fun. See you soon.
Good job.
Have a good weekend.